The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
The deadly events of what's called Black July happened 40 years ago next month. They shaped a war in Sri Lanka, the lives of everyone who lived through them, and those who came after. Tonight, powerful reflections from Tamil Canadians on those events and their legacy. Then, a sharp turn, we'll talk Raptors, the basketball variety that is, and ask, can they reclaim their former glory? It's Thursday, June 29th, and that's ahead on The Agenda. This year, Tamils around the world mark the 40th anniversary of what's called Black July. It recognizes the deadly events that transpired in 1983. Widely referred to as a pogrom against Tamils in Sri Lanka by the Sinhalese majority, it left thousands dead and set in motion a civil war that lasted more than a quarter century. The reverberations of those events continue to this day. For more, we're joined by Roy Ratnaval, author of Prisoner 1056, How I Survived War and Found Peace, and Kududia Kulendran, a Tamil Canadian who survived Black July, and Samantha Krishnapillai, founder, managing director, and editor-in-chief of the On Canada Project, and a first-generation Tamil Canadian. Welcome to all of you in studio. I should say vanakkam.
Great to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you all here. I should mention off the top to our viewers and our listeners on podcast, you will hear us say Tamil, you will hear us say Tamil. They both mean the same thing. It's just an anglicized version of the word. All right, so let's start our conversation with some background on Sri Lanka and the events of Black July. First, the island nation is located in the Indian Ocean off the east coast of India with a population of 22 million. Tamils and Sinhalese account for the two largest ethnic groups. Colombo, as you can see on the map there with the star, is Sri Lanka's largest city. In regards to Black July refers to the violent riots against Tamils that began on July 24th, 1983. Over 7 days, mobs of mainly Sinhalese attacked Tamil targets, burning, looting, and killing. According to the National Council of Canadian Tamils, the death toll is estimated to be around 3,000. More than 8,000 homes and 5,000 shops were destroyed. More than 150,000 Tamils were made homeless. These events were largely seen as the catalyst for a civil war that lasted 26 years and sent hundreds of thousands of Tamils into exile. All right, with that context, Kududia, I'm going to come to you first. For those who are unfamiliar with the history and the tensions between Tamils and Sinhalese, what would you say are some of the key points of disagreement between those two groups? Because there is a lot.
There's a lot, and it's going to take days to fully explain the whole nuances of it, because it's important to remember that the island was colonized in 3 waves, from the Dutch in the Netherlands to starting off with the Portuguese, then the Dutch, and then the British. And what they left was not an island how they found it. So the inheritance of colonization is 2 communities torn apart, a fabric completely ripped asunder. And the discord that is to date is around identity and rights of existence on the same one island, the way it was before. So on the surface, it is about I exist and you exist. We are on the same island, finite land, but it's also down to appropriation of resources, colonization of dry land, recognizing that generations that were born were spread out like dandelions across the globe, and they still have identity back to the island. So to put it down into one simple sentence is impossible, but it is about existence and the right to live.
Roy, I'm going to come to you. You know, a lot of people, as I mentioned, look at the riots as this catalyst, but you can go back into history. If we start at 1948, when the country was independent, and there are a number of sort of acts. And one act I want to hone in on is the Sinhala Only Act. What does that mean, and what did that represent at that time?
Yeah, it was, so 1948 was the independence given by Great Britain to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. In 1956, the first prime minister enacted discriminatory laws, one of them being Sinhala Only Act, which means that every Tamil has to learn Sinhala, or Sinhalese language, in order to qualify for a job in the government or any public service arena. So Tamil felt that was a forceful attack on the ability to make economic gains in the country. And that led to many other things. Standardization was the other one, which was basically saying Tamil students got to score more points to get into medical faculty, engineering faculty, and physical science, so on and so forth. Combination of many things, as was mentioned earlier. It's not a simple one event that took place, but it was just a festering of slowly taking away rights of Tamils systematically that created this war, which became, it was simmering all the time up until 83, and then 83 riots happens, and then everything, all hell broke loose, and here we are 30 some years later, or 40 years later, not a single perpetrator of the act is ever brought to justice.
If I may add very briefly, is that one can't look at the Sinhala Only Act in a silo, because around that same time, there was a very important pact that was being tabled called the Mandanaka Chalvanayam Pact, which would have created a federal state very similar to what we have here in Canada with Quebec and the rest of Canada, that would have enshrined language rights and protect dry land, and also given citizenship to all the Tamils who are of Indian origin, who were brought in by the British to as indentured labor to populate and provide labor for the tea plantations. All of that was thrown out.
All right, Samantha, I do want to bring you into this conversation. When we talk about colonization, the role, I think there's a lot, we can look at Sri Lanka as a silo, but we can take a look at sort of colonization, the role of colonization between Tamils and Sinhalese. Talk to us a little bit about that in terms of the role of that.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd also like to say that I really struggle with the language of civil war. I think a civil war, I look at, like in America, there was a civil war, there was the North and the South, and there was organization, there was, people, like it was not, I don't think a government versus like systemically discriminating against a community and then whatever emerged from that community to defend their rights. I'm not saying everything was good or bad or any of those pieces, like just, I don't think you can call that a civil war. And I think it makes it sound like there were good people on both sides when the responsibility of a government and what that government did in the same way Canada's government with Indigenous people, like America and Canada's with Black people, like it's a failure on the state. And I really had to like heal that thought in my head over the last few years. Because when you tell people like, oh, like, yeah, we had a civil war, they're like, yeah, that sucks. But that's not really what it was. At least not to me, and I say this as someone who was born here. So like maybe people who experienced it, that's what it felt like, and I'm sorry to have an opinion based on that, yeah.
In terms of the role of colonization, when we talk about that.
I think I've been writing a lot about colonialism and how the stories of our experiences in Sri Lanka and like what our people went through is not different from like what colonization has done everywhere else. There's like a playbook that colonizers use. And one of the things they do is divide and conquer. So within that space, they create divisions between the ethnicities that are there. Because if you have to fight each other, you're not going to fight your oppressor. I haven't been able to read about it as it relates specifically to Sri Lanka, but there's enough literature out there about what happened in India and like documentation of the British speaking to like, we cannot allow them to come together again to rise up. Right. We've got to like pit them against each other, and like the intentional effort to create division and hate to an island that prior to colonialism coexisted. I'm sure imperfectly, but they coexisted. And I think that's where it really becomes difficult for me to just view like from 1948 to now and be like, man, those Sinhalese people, when it feels like everyone should be held responsible, and also so should the British, the Dutch, and the Portuguese.
Roy, I want to come to you. We know that Sinhalese are primarily Buddhist, and Sri Lankans are primarily, Sri Lankan Tamils are primarily Hindu. Curious, was religion ever a factor in this conflict?
Well, this is, yeah, I mean, this is not a war about just culture, it's about religious identity as well. So there is, if you look at Sri Lankan history since the independence, the Sri Lanka's ingrained anti-Tamil sentiment and the whipped up British nationalist hysteria were perfect cement for an odious system where politicians were able to capitalize on that fear because the enraged, scared people are easily manipulated. And this is always one of the bone of contentions I have with Sinhalese friends is that they say, oh, the politicians. Well, you elect them. You repeatedly keep electing the same people over and over and expecting a different result. So current president of the country was elected the 7th time. Now, how do you expect that man to have a different policy that's going to have a different outcome? And to the colonization point, I would say that, again, the Sinhalese friends I have would say, oh, it's because of the colonization. That's an easy crutch. Look at Singapore. They had 3 distinct groups, Indians, Malays, and Chinese. They built a country that is now the richest country per income capita in the world. In 1960, they were the poorest country in the world. So I think, while I understand colonization has its impact, but at the end of the day, it's been hundreds of years now since Sri Lanka got independence. And this whole notion about we're just going to keep blaming Great Britain for all our ills, it is hard to fathom, at least for me, because I see other countries that actually progress so well with the same divisions and distinct cultures within it.
All right, we're going to pick up on those points. I do want to get into our personal stories because I know that's where a lot of us, we have shared some thoughts. So we will come back to a couple of those
I'm
thoughts.
glad.
Thank you so much.
Kirudia, you were only 12 years old, and you were in Colombo the night the riots broke out. What were your memories of that evening?
It was going from celebration of a local temple festival with my family, because that's my birthday month, evenings spent with neighbors in the front yard with music and chatter, overnight having, my grandfather is an inspector of police. And at that time he was with, he had retired, but he was still very much respected in Vliet. He was a past inspector of police of Vliet. And he was working for a security company, and him coming back and alerting, and we lived in Vliet, which is, I would say, primarily Tamil. Coming back and literally knocking on every door of our street and telling them, pack up, trouble's coming. We went from celebration to people screaming, women screaming as they were being raped, houses being burnt, my mother, I, and my grandmother running and being transported in trucks to refugee camps. We were hiding in a neighbor's house. Eyewitnessing Buddhist monks and thugs coming down my street with machetes and pointing to houses very clearly, knowing which houses had Tamils.
Because they were using voter records.
They knew. They were given information. So our house was very close to a railway line that ran on the coast, the western coast. And we had neighbors who said the train was stopped. So the train came with thugs, fully loaded, and it would stop at each junction where there was an offshoot of a street. And then the thugs would get off the train, and the train would continue. So whomever was driving the train and controlling the train knew what they were doing as well. Food that was delivered to the refugee camps were rotten, spoiled, and caused great illness and dysentery for the people at the refugee camp. Arbitrarily, those who were supposed to watch over and protect us at the refugee camp would set off guns and shoot into the air in the middle of the night so that we couldn't sleep. Watching my grandmother and my mother be terrified that I was going to be raped and trying to hide me. Babies turning up dead in the washrooms in the refugee camp. incredible lineups for the one tap that had water. People turning up with blood all over them through the night. And I'm one of the lucky ones to survive.
Right. Roy, that's similar language. I've heard you say lucky a few times. In your book, you detail the horrors. You weren't in Colombo. You were in the north at the time. But you detail the horrors of being a prisoner of war at the age of 17. You were taken from your home in front of your parents by Sri Lankan army. Why were you targeted by the Sri Lankan army?
It wasn't just me. It was so 1987, there was an operation called Operation Liberation. Basically, the Tamil Tigers controlled a swath of land, a northern part, but it's a region called Badamarachi, which is where Point Pedro, my ancestral hometown, is. So they were closing in to recapture the land. So the order was by the army to arrest any Tamil man between the age of 14 and 40, and I was 17, so I was right in that age gap. So they arrested myself and 2,700 other people, shackled us and put it on a cargo ship and took us on a 6-day or 5-day voyage to the south called Gaul. It's where the camp called Busa. And I was kept there for 2.5 months and routinely tortured along with everybody else. And some of my friends never made it. And as was mentioned by Akritika, is that I'm one of the lucky ones to be able to get out of there and sit here in a civilized country and have a civil discourse, and which is still lacks in Sri Lanka, sadly.
Samantha, you are a first-generation Tamil Canadian, just like me. These are conversations and stories that may have been shared, may have not. What was it like in your household? Was the events of Black July talked about? Was conflict and war talked about?
Yeah, I'd like to, at some point, come back to the comment about a civilized country being in Canada. I have thoughts around that, but yeah, I'll be honest. It wasn't really talked about. I really struggled to understand what my spot was in the world. I felt like it was so easy to find out, what king was, how many wives Henry VIII had, or whatever number he was. But it was so much harder to learn my history, and then that made me feel like our history wasn't good. We were not worth the same. Of course, racism exists when we couldn't even keep our records, That, feeling of internalized racism stayed with me for a very, very long time. And I would say that I think the vast majority of us who live within Canada carry a piece of that internalized racism because we're trying to find success in a space that's designed around whiteness and white supremacy culture. But yeah, Black July was not really spoken about at home. And if it was called the riots, not really Black July. And it wasn't really until until 2009, really, where it kind of started to come up.
Right, there were protests. You went to one. You didn't even know.
At that point, it was I had gathered it, but not because we had sat down and talked about it. It was more like the pieces of it was being shared with me. Or someone at school that was Tamil had mentioned, it's not the way you could sit down and read a book about it. It was kind of offered in weird ways to me over time. But then we had the protests, and then it wasn't really until my own deep research and then pushing my parents to share it, because I also didn't want to be here, please give me all your trauma that they've in order to find success and give me the life I have here today. Maybe part of that survival involved pushing it down, and I can't fault them for that when mental health conversations still aren't where they need to be in our community. So yeah, it wasn't really discussed.
Gulia, you are a parent. You have 2 kids. I'm curious, how did you navigate that conversation? Because you had made an effort to let them sort of figure out their journey and stuff, and if they had come to you with questions, that was sort of the idea.
So my husband and I, he's also Tamil, when we became parents, we made a conscious decision that we didn't want to raise our children mired and in the sense of locked into the identity of what he and I have journeyed through. Though he did not, he was not on the island for 83, he himself has lost very close family at point blank range to bullets from Sri Lankan army guns. His grandfather, his uncles, multiple deaths in his family, and a loss of immense loss to his family. So the first time I went public with my story was for the 25th anniversary of the July pogrom. And I struggled with even the title of Black July because that is, it connotates something very negative and should not be minimizing any community as such. I would much prefer a July pogrom. And that decision was not an easy one. Something that we rarely get to speak about is something horrific that happened in 1981 as a precursor to the riots. And that was the burning of the Jaffna Library. Jaffna being the northernmost prolific city for where the Tamil population was. The loss of this library, and to put it into a North American context, is if the Yale Library burnt by intent, arson, malicious intent. If somebody went out there and set the Yale Library aflame, and the outrage that would come would permeate across from coast to coast to coast, and not be limited to just USA, it would come to Canada and across the world. That is the loss of intellectual knowledge and historical heritage. There were palm leaves that were thousands of years old that had a continuity of the story of the Tamil people on this planet, Tamil being one of the most ancient languages and recognized globally. I have a cousin who, in our family, who witnessed that burning. And it traumatized him so deeply that he never quite recovered. And as much as he did come to Canada and be accepted as a refugee, and may have had the semblance of whatever structural safety that Canada gave, he never recovered. And it was a key impact in his life till he took it himself. That is the outpouring. So when we raised our children, at the 25th anniversary, my children, my son at 9 and my daughter at 7, got to hear my story because I was one of the living exhibits. My son's reaction was, "Why didn't you tell me?" My daughter, being much younger, was more of, "What is a refugee camp? What does that mean? Where did you sleep? Did you get food?" Subsequently, they were at an age where their inquiry was driven by themselves. So now they call themselves Tamil Canadian, fully informed by themselves, and are completely anchored in an identity that they have formulated and own.
All right, we are going to get to conversations about identity. Roy, I do want to come to you. Your start in Canada is a story I think is very relatable to many. You had $100 in your pocket. You were eager to make something to make your family proud, but you had war in the background. Your parents were both back home. What would you say was the toughest part about coming here?
Well, just not knowing anyone. I was young, 18 years old, never left the country. You lose your friends, your family, your social fabric, your safety net. You had to come here, learn a new language, new cultures, figure out a way to make a living. So that was the hardest part. And but I sort of give my rise in this country, just like many of us, Tamil community, who have done really well in this country, in one generation, and that's 30 years. We have lifted ourselves from misery to prosperity and victims to victors. And to me, it's a remarkable journey collectively. It's not just me. I mean, every single person that I know who came here from Sri Lanka had achieved success in their own right. And so for me, I was lucky enough to have had many great mentors when I came here, very young. And that really helped me to adapt to this country in the absence of advice of my parents. And so that was what happened.
How, in your book is titled, You Found Peace. And one who's read your book would have to ask, how do you not become bitter? You're someone who, at 18, at a very young age, comes to this country, don't know many people. You lose your father shortly after,
right,
within days. and sort of have to figure out how to balance all of that. You do visit back home at some point.
One time, yeah.
One time to go visit Point Pedro. But how do you not become bitter? How do
So, listen, 2 days after I landed, my father was shot and killed. So, given his untimely, unjust death, it left me with the feeling, if I did well enough in life, somehow I could give the life that he always wanted to have. So I had to live for two people. Emotional wounds never heal, they fester. So earlier on, I was very bitter, angry at the world, up until maybe my late 20s. Nothing good ever came from that. So I had this belief that even though past events can be changed, they can serve as a lesson in dealing with challenges of life to pursue a life of happiness. And when you can't change the situation, you're forced to change yourself. So what I decided to do is not to let my past trip me every single time, to focus on the future. Future is that if I built a life for myself that is happy, well-adjusted, and I could somehow justify my father's, him sending me here to make him proud, make my parents proud. So that became my coal for the furnace of ambition, per se, just drove me, became sort of my single goal. But it came at an expense. I mean, I reflect on that in the book about how much it left an emotional deficit in the house, with my relationship with my wife. But now I'm looking at it in my early 50s, I can sort of reconcile all that. I would have done things differently. But nonetheless, I would give myself a 5 out of 10 still. And so it's really, one of the reasons I wrote the book is to give a voice to the upcoming generation, and also to tell our story, our collective story, our trauma to the world. And then to really give, in my opinion, homage to a country that gave us a second lease in life. By no means is it a perfect nation. It has its flaws, but it's a million times better than what I left behind, I can tell you that. And so that's why I wanted to write this book, and to give some color to that.
All right, we only have a few minutes, but I have lots more questions to ask Samantha. In Ontario, we have Tamil Genocide Education Week. Federally, there is Tamil Genocide Remembrance Day. Is there a reluctance to call it a genocide worldwide? There is this, in terms of when we talk about sort of the language around it, you talked about it a little bit when we talked about civil war. Is there any reluctance at all in terms of understanding that this wasn't as fair?
If it was a genocide or not?
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't called it anything else other than that. So it's hard to think of it not being called that, because that's what it was. And I don't think I need some Harvard professor to say it. I've heard the stories, I've heard what happened, I've looked into it myself. It was a genocide. And I think it's important to call things what they are as accurately as possible, so that we're able to identify it, name it, heal from it. So I hope, is that what that week is called? That's great, that's awesome. They should call it that, and they should keep calling it that until there aren't genocides in the world.
Kira, I'll get your take on that as well.
It is a genocide. I wish it was, but it is. It is still ongoing.
You're right. Sorry.
The colonization is still ongoing. The rapes are still ongoing. The forced sterilizations are still ongoing. People aren't talking about it. Unfortunately, the structure of the world is such that unless an old white man in a seat of power says it is a genocide, it doesn't matter. George W. Bush said Darfur was a genocide. Automatically, right away, funding happened, recognition happened, documentaries happened. But we had eminent, highly respected humanitarian lawyers that were recognized by Amnesty write books calling what is happening to the Tamil people genocide. How much more argument do we need? The people themselves say it. It is not a matter of how many people have died. It is not a matter of whether how many whales are dying or how many ants are being stomped on. They all matter. If the people say it's a genocide because the evidence before you is systematic eradication of knowledge, like the burning of the Jaffna Library, the forced sterilization, the forced colonization of dry lands, the removal of language rights, and the erasure of places of faith and temples and houses and renaming of streets, all the hallmarks as defined by United Nations for genocide, it is a genocide. It walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck. It's a duck.
All right. Outside looking in, so much of the Tamil experience here in Canada is linked to war, is linked to trauma, is linked to genocide. What do you want people to know about Tamils beyond that? I'll start with Roy.
I think we're one of the most resilient group of people. I say that with 100% certainty of what we have achieved in this country. It come at a cost. I mean, a lot of people have not spoken about the war. A lot of mental issues in the community, as Samantha mentioned, including my mother, who suffered severely under mental illness, which one of the reasons I support the topic talking about that, because mental illness is a taboo in any community, especially in our community. I would say, if you were to sum up Tamils in one word, resilient. And I think what we have achieved in 30 years is remarkable. I think probably one of the most successful immigrant groups in the recent times.
All right, Samantha.
Yeah, I think that resilience is an interesting word. This is hard because, culturally, I don't want to contradict with you because you're my elder and I want to, be respectful of it. But at the same time, I'm feeling a visceral reaction to some of the stuff you're saying, particularly around naming it as, we've come so far. We have, but in a country that is committing a genocide against Indigenous peoples, not unlike what we experienced or you experienced back there, and so I think it's hard because you both and ancestrally have experienced colonization and has experienced by the British, but also currently, presently, what's going on there, that oppression, and then you're coming here and. I'm so grateful you all came here. I have a life here because you came here. And we are complicit in the genocide of Indigenous people here. And I respect and I understand why that is hard for the older generations, but for people born here, we cannot look at that issue as separate. Doing so is failing the people who were killed in Sri Lanka. Doing so is failing what happened to all of us and ancestrally happened to us. And that's really hard for me to hear us talk about how successful we are when I think about the lack of clean water for Indigenous people, the erasure of their history, the sexual assault, the fact that there is an ongoing genocide against missing and murdered Indigenous women in this country that nobody talks about, but it's happening every single day. This is the actual issues that we need to be talking about as Tamils because, and I say this all the time when I write, Canada will never, ever care about Tamils in Sri Lanka. It doesn't care. It's not going to care. It might, if that Canada cared about the human rights of every single person within its borders. If Canada can care about Indigenous peoples, Black peoples, trans people, migrants, low-income people, disabled people, people of color, if it cares about those people because of their human rights and they should be valued, then that Canada will show up for justice in Sri Lanka and India and every other country that's being impacted. So it's really hard for me to separate that because my identity is both. I have a birthright to my Tamil identity, and by virtue of the dumb luck of being born, right? No control over it, but being born here, I have to hold both of those. So yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Thank you for that. Kiru, we only have about 30 seconds left. That was that was a very important but very powerful point. As a takeaway, what do you want people to know about Tamils beyond that, if you want to pick up on what Samantha had to say as well?
My message is to be proud to be Tamil. And to be Tamil is not from a particular demographic or geography. Tamils are across this globe. It doesn't matter if you're from South Africa, Mauritius, Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, Switzerland, France. We are all Tamil, and stop the division.
Kirudia, Samantha, Roy, thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for sharing your stories. Very powerful stuff. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was just 4 short years ago when the Toronto Raptors and 1 million of their closest friends celebrated their NBA championship with a parade for the ages. It all seems like part of the team's distant past. This year, they didn't even make the playoffs. It led to big changes in the organization on and off the court. What's needed to get the team moving in a more winning direction? Let's ask freelance basketball journalist Katie Heindel, who is the creator behind the Basketball Feelings podcast and newsletter, and Vivek Jacob, freelance sports journalist and staff writer for Raptors.com. Thank you both for joining us in studio. We're going to talk shiny new additions. Grady Dick, 13th overall. This is a beautiful photo. Shoulder pads and all, red sequins. It's like he knew he was coming to the Raptors. Vivek, I'll come to you first. Overall thoughts on this pick. Does this answer a lot of holes for the team?
It answers one major hole, which was shooting, and that's something the Raptors have lacked over the last couple of years. And so to bring him in, have his outside shot, that's something the Raptors will really rely on. And the fact that he's not just someone who can catch and shoot, like he can shoot in a lot of different ways. And I think, especially off the dribble, that's something that's going to help as well. And yeah, overall, for sure, the shooting is a major need.
Katie, high IQ, 6'8", fills in that sort of typical, if we look at sort of the roster, fits that scheme. Defensively, some questions there, but overall, thoughts on Grady Dick?
Yeah, I think there are always going to be, defensive questions, especially with a rookie, coming in like that. I think the bigger need that we haven't mentioned yet is the vibes need, generally.
The vibes.
And just like the general, just like getting back to a more positive atmosphere, getting back to just some more energy on the team. Things were pretty dire, I think, as we saw the team leave this season. I mean, that's being generous. You could go all the way back to, January and pre-All-Star break. But I think just what we've seen of him so far, his confidence is just like the TikToks are worth a deep dive if anybody wants to go check those out. But I also just think for a lot of the young guys like Precious Achiuwa, Scotty Barnes to be able to play off of on the floor. And this is a team that wants to focus more on getting back to development, getting back to the basics in that sense. So I think he's coming also into a program that's going to be the perfect fit for him.
Yeah, let me ask you about that, because you did get a chance to chat with him. How does he fit on and off the court? I know he does a few impersonations. He's a bit of a goofball.
Yeah, I mean, he does a Donald Duck voice, which he learned from his grandpa. And,
Can you give us a little taste of what you got? No.
No, absolutely not. But I think he's someone who's going to be, a positive influence in the locker room. I think he seems like the type of personality who has learned to take losses in stride and just maintain a positive, demeanor throughout it all. And I think that's really important for a young kid coming in. And I think beyond that, the fact that he already has a bit of a relationship with Scotty Barnes, I think that helps. And he seems to really get along with the coach already, Darko Rajakovic. And I think that can only lead to positive things as well.
Mm-hmm. All right, on that note, we have a photo. Obviously, we have a new head coach here. This is a photo of Darko with Raptors president Masai Ujiri. Katie, how different will he be from Nurse?
I think very different. I mean, you could go back to maybe the early days of Nurse's tenure, or even go back farther to when Nick was an assistant with the team. Again, to just touch on that developmental caliber. Darko's been a coach for almost 2 decades now. He's coached he's coached internationally. He's coached with OKC, the Memphis Grizzlies, and now Toronto. I think he's such an energetic guy. He's a bit younger. He's very relentlessly positive, which again, I feel like is something that the team just needs in spades right now. So from what we saw, we were at his introductory presser, just he's so excited to be here, so thrilled to be here. I think the organization setting up such an event to welcome him also shows that they're really willing to turn over a new leaf for him. And I mean, they've brought Gemma Malala back, who was with the Warriors, another developmental asset, and just again, relentlessly positive. But we've been around him like a relentlessly positive guy. All of this to me speaks so well for the kind of chemistry rebuild that I think the team needs right now.
You say rebuild. It's not unusual for Masai to go off the board. There are a lot of big names for head coaches this summer. He goes with someone that a lot of people are like, who's that? Obviously has the credentials there, but a lot of people digging. I'm curious, does this decision to hire Darko change sort of the direction of the team? We talk about player development, that's where he's at. Are we at instant success? Are we contending? Where do we stand on that?
Yeah, I think the Raptors are still deciding on that. I think when they look at what they have to do in free agency, that'll have a big say in terms of being able to bring back Fred VanVleet and Jakob Poeltl. But I think they wanted a coach who was comfortable going either way. And so with Darko Rajakovic's history, they probably said, hey, the team last year they didn't fulfill their potential. So if we get the vibes right, if we get the positivity back, what does this team look like? And then if they're still underperforming, then you can go from there. I think that's the way they're leaning right now. And then if it comes to it, and again, you look at Darko Rajakovic, for all the experience he has, he doesn't have head coaching experience. You look at the assistants that they've brought in, none of them have head coaching experience. And so that does leave a bit of a concern in terms of trying to win at the highest level. And so if they aren't able to get things right off the top and say, you're 20 games into the season and you only have, 7 or 8 wins, then there's going to be a lot of questions asked.
I will quickly just add that, just to push back on you a little, Nurse obviously didn't have head coaching experience at that time in the NBA. So I think the Raptors, I really like them going outside of what we would call like this insular NBA head coaching pool, which sometimes gets to feel like musical chairs a little bit when you see the same names pop up for team after team. Obviously, it can be a tried and true method. It works for some franchises, but I think it works for very established franchises, which already probably have a few superstars in place. That never hurts. So I think I like Toronto taking, it also feels disingenuous to say they're taking a chance on this guy because he's got the credentials. But I think to really turn over a new leaf in this way, I got a lot of confidence in the guy.
All right, I do want to pick a little bit about our former head coach. Any new insights as to what went wrong? I know, this was, we didn't make the playoffs. Was it just time for a new change, or were there some rumblings inside that, something else was going on?
I don't think you need to be like an empath to get a sense that there was a little bit of a disconnect, whether that was between Nurse and some of his coaching staff or Nurse and some of the guys on the team. It just seemed to be a misfit. It seemed to get a lot worse as the season wore on. Obviously losing, nobody likes losing, and that's going to be terrible for morale as well. Nick Nurse is a technically great coach, but I think he coaches to a standard that's up here, and that makes sense considering the team he got when he was named head coach. What I didn't really like this past season was that he didn't necessarily adjust all the time, for the team he actually had. And a lot of the young players on the team, which we just didn't really see in the lineup. So I think there was a lot of strain. Again, I think it did just get worse. I haven't heard anything new other than I feel like it was probably a needed break on both sides.
Yeah, I think winning can mask a lot of things, and I think especially his public call-outs with players probably wore thin when you're losing and you don't have a distinct role. I think to handle things in-house first at least and go that route before you're publicly calling out a player and saying that they're not giving you out, and then they don't, even when they play well one night and then they don't play for the next 5 games. It's tough to find a rhythm that way. So I think all those things led to the changes that we've seen this summer so far.
Look, I think we can all say in Masai we trust, right? I think generally that's the spoken word there. But is it time for the franchise to start looking beyond Masai? I know he had taken some responsibility at the end of the season, that it starts with him. But is it something? I know we're just getting into the summer and we're building a team, but is that something that we think about?
I feel like it's sacrilegious to think about that.
Right?
I mean, he's a leader of you could say the most successful Toronto sports franchise. He's made it that way. I don't think so. My thought has always been it's not going to be the Raptors leaving Masai behind. It will be the other way around. And honestly, sometimes I think that won't even be for NBA aspirations, for something probably grander, He's so involved with his Giants of Africa Foundation and really worthwhile philanthropic ventures, and I think his head's sort of always on a swivel to a much broader global perspective. So I think that should potentially be the worry, not the worry of should MLSE move on from Masai. Not yet.
All right, I want to talk about our current roster. A few names, the big names we'll talk about. Pascal, gets a lot of flack throughout the season. Does he have another gear in him?
I think he's trying to find it. I think that's what we've watched play out ever since Kawhi Leonard left, and he was kind of put in this difficult situation where the Raptors didn't have any cap space or maneuverability after Kawhi left to try and bring in that type of player back. And so they said, hey, Pascal, here's the keys. Let's see what you've got. And I think he's definitely a far better player than he was even in 2018-19 when they won the championship. And he's made the All-NBA team twice since then. And I think, that sort of top echelon is just really, really tough to crack. And, you think about what he was when he came in versus where he is now. He's an incredible player, and the Raptors are lucky to have him. But you have some tough decisions to make right now because of the way the salary cap works and the contract he could potentially be eligible for.
All right. I want to pop up another photo because we're going to talk about the man beside Pascal. Katie, Fred VanVleet. How likely are we going to see him back in that jersey this fall?
I mean, I might be the rare voice that thinks very likely. Obviously, the money is going to be a big concern, and money talks, especially with the new CBA that was just introduced. But I think you look at this team, as raw as it seemed last season, it is getting a little bit more green this season with the addition of Grady Dick, and you're gonna want to bring in Delano Banton, Jeff Doughton Jr. Some of the guys that didn't really get a chance to get minutes last season. I think you need a point guard.
Right.
This is just the basic fact, right? We all talk about Vision 6-9 and, that the team can play positionless. They can to a point, but you need an organizer on the floor. I think Fred is that. Obviously, there's been some tension, within the franchise. Also, I think with what he wants, and if somebody like the Houston Rockets come in and offer him more, I think it will be really up to the Raptors to match. But that should be the first priority.
Well, let's talk about the rumors are just rumors sometimes, and sometimes as Raptor fans, maybe we don't want to look at that. But a lot of money has been reported. Michael Grange reported that the Rockets are planning to tempt Fred with $40 million per year. It would probably be a shorter contract. What's the likelihood of Freddie accepting something like that?
Yeah, so that's the belief right now, that Houston will offer a 2-year deal worth about $84 million. And if you're Fred VanVleet, I think that is very appealing because, one, you get that kind of money.
That's good money.
Number two, you can see the light at the end of the tunnel if things go wrong. And so if you don't like it, hey, it's a 2-year contract, and then you can figure your way out after that. And so I think the other thing that is kind of an underlying issue with the Raptors right now, and this probably goes back to the Masai conversation, is there has been whispers about ownership and what's changing with that. And so if you're Fred VanVleet and you feel like those wheels are turning and maybe there isn't the commitment to winning that there was prior to and in winning the championship, then maybe you decide to move on and then evaluate in a couple of years. So I think that's definitely a significant threat from the Houston Rockets. And to Katie's point, the Raptors absolutely cannot afford to lose him. And so if it gets into a bidding war, I think the Raptors have to keep up.
All right, I'm gonna throw some more rumors out there. DAngelo Russell, spotted in Toronto, playing pickup ball at the University of Toronto, playing out on the East End as well. Are there any point guards that we should be eyeing? Is this something that we should be looking at? I know there was a couple of other players, not even to say, but is there potential that Lowry makes some sort of a comeback here to the Raptors as well?
I mean, that would be my personal dream. I don't think it's necessarily likely. I also wish that the Raptors were that blatant, like just suddenly turned that blatant with tampering that they invited DAngelo Russell.
Right.
I believe his partner's from Oakville, so I think that's why he was up here, just in a casual trip.
There we go.
It is a pretty thin, I think you'd agree, like it is a pretty thin free agency. There are some guys that I just rooted for generally in the league, like Will Barton, who's with the Wizards now, who are in a bit of a rebuild. So perhaps, like if Fred were to go, the Raptors could get in there and potentially, I don't know what they would offer at this point, but get someone decent in return if you're trying to play Pascal and Scotty Barnes more in that point position. But I think you got to stand pat this summer. There's not a lot out there.
I think you can't afford to do anything else. The main thing is if Fred VanVleet decides to leave, there's no way to replace that. If Jakob Poeltl decides to leave, there's no way to replace that. And so I think they put themselves in a corner, and they absolutely have to bring them back.
All right, let's talk about some superstars, because you had mentioned there's not a lot out there. There are some that are available. The likelihood of them coming here, we don't know. James Harden, Kyrie Irving, Chris Middleton, Draymond Green. There's an appetizing list of free agents out there. I'm just going to give you the reins here. If you could have any free agent out there right now that would address some of the issues, potentially superstar or filling in a role position, who are you gunning for? I'll start getting.
Just anybody, right?
Yeah, anybody.
I mean, this is such like a safe pick, but I have come around so hard on Chris Middleton just because he's just he's like your workaday guy. He's going to do anything you ask of him. Generally, also I understand like a lot of those other stars are going to go their own way. They can also be a bit mercurial, and Chris Middleton just isn't that.
He's an overall good guy. All right.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go with the best guy on the market, James Harden.
Really?
I mean, if you're throwing away, the money, I mean, the Raptors don't have the money to go after him, but if we're throwing all that aside, you go after the best guy. I think he's the best one available. And you look at a guy like Draymond Green, he wouldn't really fit this team right now. I don't think they want to deal with a Kyrie Irving on this team. So
fair enough. A lot has been made about the Canadian talent. Jamal Murray just winning his championship. Shea out of Hamilton just, has skyrocketed, getting some nods for MVP there. RJ Barrett doing a solid job in New York. What's the likelihood of securing a Canadian on this team, a star Canadian on this team? And should that be in the conversation when we look at Toronto Raptors, the lone Canadian team?
I mean, we shouldn't discount the already our star Canadians
That's
on the
correct.
team. Chris Boucher, Delano Ben, Toronto's own.
Yeah.
I think it perhaps would have been a priority for this team almost 2 seasons ago, the unfortunate Tampa season before they went to Tampa. But now I think it's more about retooling with who the Raptors have, keeping the guys that they have to keep. Sometimes to me, the Canadian thing seems like an optics play, and I would hope that those guys would eventually be desirous to come here. But some of the guys you mentioned, I think, are in pretty fantastic situations and don't necessarily want to leave them. I think we should be prideful enough to watch these guys play for Team Canada in that situation rather than keeping our fingers crossed that they're going to come to Toronto.
There, I'll get your take on that as well.
I'll keep my fingers crossed. I mean, the reality is Toronto hasn't been a superstar free agent destination. And so if you can appeal to the local guys, then why not? And so if there were to come a time where maybe, Jamal Murray has already won his championship in Denver, if he feels secure about that and wants to, maybe come home, absolutely.
Why aren't we a superstar destination? We've won in 2019. What do we need to do to cement, hey, this is, people like to say and shout out Toronto as the best city to travel to. Players mention that. But what is it? What is still holding us back?
Look, I think unquestionably it's one of the best cities in the NBA. And I think it just comes down to it, just not being LA. And, that type of conversation is what you get into. And, Kawhi Leonard was a perfect example, right? You had a championship team, you had a good chance of running it back and, going for another one, but he just wanted to be home.
Yep.
And you can't really argue against that, right? And he's spoken very highly of Toronto. And so, the reality is, for them to have 29 cities where, maybe they're more familiar with, to be there, it probably appeals to them, and it is what it is. And so that's where, again, you just got to take advantage. If you do have the guys who are from here and want to be here, why not go after them?
All right, we talked about home, so we're going to talk Team Canada. Jordi Fernandez, he was in the running for head coach for the Toronto Raptors, but he was named the new head coach for the Canadian men's basketball team. Is he the right choice to replace Nick Nurse?
I think so. I think, again, there's a sense that my sense was that Nick Nurse and probably Daryl Morey of the Sixers wanted Nick Nurse to just kind of cut ties with the Raptors, with Canada. And Jordy is a great coach. He was in the running for a reason. I think Team Canada could do with a nice, different kind of energy injection, different style of coaching. He already knows and has worked with a lot of the guys on the team, a lot of guys around the league. I think it's a great fit.
All right, Vic.
I think the big thing for me would be just his offensive acumen. I think when you look at his history, he's been tied to Mike Brown for a long time, even with the Cleveland Cavaliers when LeBron was there the first time around. And so I think that history, and you look at the Sacramento Kings right now, one of the best offenses, if not the best offense in the league, what he would be able to bring to this Team Canada setup would be very intriguing.
This is a fairly talented Team Canada that's going into the World Cup this summer. Their eyes obviously on Paris. What's your prognosis for how far the men's team can go?
First, I want to shout out the women's team.
Let's shout them out.
Who I believe just made they qualified yesterday.
There you
So
go.
I feel like they're often overshadowed. They have long been the more talented team, consistently competitive team, I would say. So shout out to them. But I do think, again, Jamal Murray was injured the last time this happened. A lot of other guys weren't able to commit. So I think now with this coaching change, it is quite close to when they've got to start playing. But again, these are guys that are used to being thrown in the mix. If you look at the Olympics or now with Team Canada, they're used to being thrown in the mix. They watch each other play all the time. They can usually adapt pretty well to that. I think there should be good momentum going into the qualifier.
You got the last word.
Yeah, you said the word commit, and I think that's been the biggest thing since they failed to qualify for the previous Olympics. Nick Nurse set a plan in place that, hey, we have to get serious about this. If you want to play in 2024, there has to be the commitment beginning in 2021. And that's where you saw Shai Gilgeous-Alexander play throughout qualifying. And so now, being at the FIBA World Cup, I think that's a huge opportunity to secure qualification for the Olympics. And hopefully, the commitment continues beyond Nick Nurse's exit.
All right. They always say the regular season's the exciting part, but for me, it's the summer. This is where all this stuff happens. I want to thank you both for coming in. It's going to be an exciting summer and fall, and hopefully we have you guys back in the studio. Thank you so much.
Well,
Thanks so
David,
much for
thank you
having
so
me.
much.
That is the agenda for Thursday, June 29th, 2023. Tomorrow is the final program of this 17th season of The Agenda. Nam Kiwanuka gets both sides in the fireworks debate. I'm Jay Jaganathan. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and Nam, we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.